Well, hello there. My name is Daniel, and in this presentation called Stories in the Spiritual Caregiver is something that I created and gave as part of my summer training within Providence Health. And this training is called CPE. It stands for Clinical Psychospiritual Education. Essentially, it's training people to be chaplains, training people to meet with individuals in the hospital, patients, as well as staff who are struggling, and be able to hear their stories and help them navigate through their pain. I did this as part of my pastoral education, but many people in my program were doing it as part of their own training in this vocation, aiming to be spiritual caregivers or hospital chaplains full time. And as part of this training program, we were each required to create and give a presentation on something that we are passionate about. And I chose this topic. My aim in this presentation is to demonstrate why we as spiritual caregivers should make a habit of regularly reading, watching, and listening to good stories. And while I designed this presentation for people who are spiritual caregivers in a hospital setting, I really think it can apply beyond this. I think a spiritual caregiver could be a teacher, it could be a pastor, of course, or a clergy member, but it could also be anybody who works one-on-one or in groups with people, includes friends and family members. This presentation will have kind of 4 components to it. I'll open with a question, and then I'll offer 6 ways that I think good literature, good stories can help us in our work as spiritual caregivers. I'll then offer a guiding principle in choosing the kinds of stories that can help us with this. And then I'll end with 4 genres of stories. And a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know, before I went to university, I spent many years as a hobby doing film criticism. I would go to film festivals and interview the directors or the production team members and write reviews and feature articles about their work. I then went to do an undergraduate in English, which was really a training in how to read literature and how literature works. And then I'm now completing my Master of Divinity here in Vancouver, hoping to become an Anglican priest. And so really this topic kind of merges both of my loves, my love of stories and literature and movies, and my love of spiritual caregiving. Throughout my master's degree, even though I'm no longer in my undergrad doing English, I've continued to stay in that world by reading a lot of books and watching a lot of films. It's one of my favorite things to do, but also by presenting almost annually at a conference on Christianity and literature. And so this presentation, like I say, bridges that gap. So let me start by asking a question. Is there a story, this could be a novel, a film, or even a song, which has shaped how you relate to people? I wonder what story or novel or film that is that you read maybe recently or many, many years ago that continues to shape how you interact with people. For me, this is a picture book of The Christmas Miracle of Jonathan Toomey by Susan Wojciechowski and illustrated by the great P.J. Lynch. It's a story about a old woodcarver, a woodcarver who appears old in the village. He's not very well liked by the villagers because he's rather grumpy and gruff on the exterior. But over the course of several weeks, a newcomer to the village and her son chip away at his heart a little bit and hire him to do a job and show up in his home once a week. And through their attention and love, the woodcarver is able to access the reason for his gruff exterior and the real grief, the real trauma that he experienced several years ago. And through the woman and her son, but also through the woodcarver's own efforts, a transformation happens in this person's life. I actually read this story to my class in the CPE, and we discussed how it is similar to the work that we were doing as chaplains, the work of knocking on people's doors repeatedly, persistently, and inviting them to open up their heart to us. And by opening their heart and getting to their places of pain, and their places of trial, we were uncovering joy. And so this book, I was read it as a kid when it first came out in 1997, and every year I've tended to read it aloud to whoever has gathered in our home around the Christmas season. And so it's a story that over the years really has shaped, I think, how I relate to people and how I think about people in ways that I'm still learning. Again, I wonder what story that is for you. Maybe it's a picture book. Maybe it's something else. Now, the the assumption that I'm going up against by working on this presentation is something like this. And I wonder if you've heard this before, or perhaps even thought it before. Certainly, you probably will encounter it at some point. Reading fiction is a waste of time. Those stories are imaginary and therefore not real, even lies. We should instead be more practical with our time by reading the Bible, by reading nonfiction books which help us in our work, or by caring for those whom we are called to serve. The first reason is that stories train our imagination so that we are better at recognizing and valuing our lives as well as the lives of those around us. Now, to get at this, I want to draw from a Canadian Christian philosopher named James K. Smith, or Jamie Smith, in his work Imagining the Kingdom. And he has a quote. It's rather long. It's the longest quote that I'll be offering in this presentation, but I think it's worth engaging in. Let me read it for you. He says, "Much of our action is not the fruit of conscious deliberation. Instead, it emerges from how we imagine the world. What we do is driven by who we are, by the kind of person we have become. And that shaping of our character is, to a great extent, the effect of stories that have captivated us, that have sunk into our bones. Stories that picture what we think life is about, what constitutes the good life. We live into the stories we've absorbed. We become participants in the drama that has captivated us. And such stories capture our imagination precisely because narrative trains our emotions, and those emotions actually condition our perception of the world." So what is he saying here? Well, he's saying that stories shape us, that stories and the stories that we lean into and absorb the most are what train us into how we perceive others and how we perceive the world itself. Maybe you're familiar with this kind of thinking when it comes to worldview. Maybe you've applied this to the Bible itself. And indeed, we are storied by the stories of the Bible. But I wonder if we're less inclined to think about people this way. That what Jamie Smith is getting at here is that our imagination needs training for how we relate to people, and that stories train us for this work. Let me give you an example of another writer who gets at something slightly similar. And this is Eugene Peterson. He was a writer and a pastor for many decades, and wrote many wonderful books about his wisdom in that vocation. And I cite him a lot in this presentation because he has articulated very well what it is to be a pastor, someone who cares for the souls of people, who reads literature, and why that reading of literature is immensely valuable for a pastor. He talks about a mentor of his. He said he was struggling in his vocation early on in his pastoring vocation, He was struggling because he was struggling to see people as full of imagination. He was getting kind of stuck in the cliches of thinking about people and rather bored about it. He said he was really looking for a mentor who would help him do this, and he couldn't find any living mentors in the small town that he was based out of. But then one day he discovered such a mentor in a long dead writer, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, who died in 1888. Peterson called him a vocational mentor unlike any other. In fact, Peterson writes that he kept appointments with FD in his calendar, and a couple times a week he would spend about an hour in his calendar with FD, reading through all 6 of his books. He talks in his own book, Eugene Peterson, talks about how these appointments, he says, enlarged my imagination. They caused him to see his parishioners differently. They taught him to listen more to his parishioners and to see what he calls the large potentialities of the soul. Because Dostoevsky captured in his novels the human spirit so well in ways that enlarged Peterson's own imagination, he was able to see his parishioners with a new imagination and return to pastoring with a passion and a vigor that was dying in him before this. So this is what I mean by the way that fiction can train our imagination so that we are better at recognizing and valuing the lives of others. That's my first reason. The second is that fiction opens us up to what I will call embodied mystery. Now, what I mean by this is that artists, all good artists, really of all kinds, whether they're writers or painters or rappers or musicians, they will talk about how they often, if they're doing their art well, they are tapping in to something beyond them. By listening carefully and by honing their craft and by being true to what they hear, they access something beyond the here and now. Here's Eugene Peterson again on this. He articulates this quite well. He says, when we listen to writers, and of course this is true of other artists as well, talk about their writing, what we hear them saying is that they do not so much make up a story as have it come to them. They write things they never knew, or at least never knew that they knew. Images and plots enter their awareness, an arrival from somewhere else. They become writers, real writers, when they cultivate openness to these mysterious comings and goings. They become listeners to these presences. This is the grounding for all creative work. And it's true that as I've read accounts of artists, even and perhaps especially artists without a religious faith, they will describe this process again and again in many different ways. And what Eugene Peterson adds to the end of this sentence, I think is brilliant. He says, it is the grounding for all creative work, but it's also the grounding for spirituality. And isn't this true that our work as spiritual caregivers or pastors or mentors is to be attuned to that mysterious coming and going that we call God, and cultivating an openness to that through prayer or worship or reading, and then alerting others to that in their own work. And so no wonder that artists, good artists, are such good companions of those of us who do this kind of work. I'm going to describe this a little bit more by turning to the work of Flannery O'Connor, the great Catholic short story writer who died tragically young in 1964. Like I said, she was Catholic, and she writes in her excellent book, Mystery and Manners, it's a nonfiction book about her work as an artist. She says, we Catholics are very much given to the instant answer. Fiction doesn't have any. It leaves us, like Job, with a renewed sense of mystery. And isn't it true that so many people of religious faith are very much given to the instant answer? She goes on, she says, a fiction writer is concerned with mystery that is lived. He or she or they is concerned with ultimate mystery as we find it embodied in the concrete world of sense experience. So in other words, fiction writers are concerned with what I describe as embodied mystery. How mystery, God, reveals itself in the specific details, the very specific details of our material human world. I wonder if you pick up O'Connor's incarnational language here. This is very much the story of God becoming flesh in the Gospels. So fiction, because it is concerned with the particulars of embodied life and how those details intersect with mystery, with God, that is very similar to our work as spiritual caregivers or pastors or mentors or teachers. So that is why I say that mystery opens us up, or rather fiction opens us up to embodied mystery, mystery taking shape in the lives of those around us. My third reason is that fiction embeds us in story. You see, novels and short stories and movies even help us recognize the structure to our lives. Our life doesn't often feel like it has structure. It can be chaotic. It too often doesn't make sense. Fiction can help us in our efforts to try to recognize patterns in life and then glimpse the story that we are part of. And this is because a lot of fiction is attending to patterns, the patterns that can grow over the course of a whole life, or in some cases, many generations. I'm thinking here of a book, 6,000 Years of Longing, and how the story of multiple generations is told. But this is also true of a life, or just a small section of a life, perhaps even a day, such as James Joyce's Ulysses. A writer who I quite like on this is Marilyn Shandlin McIntyre. She is an expert in the medical humanities, bridging the gap between the medical world and the humanities world. And she writes, "We can understand things rightly only if we understand them over time. That is, in terms of their stories of conception, growth, development, and death. Everything we look at is embodied in story." And so stories or fiction allow us to understand the scope of a person, to take in a great deal of time over the course of a few hours or a few days as we read that book or watch that movie. Peterson, again, gets something similar. He says, "Existence has a story shape. I read novels frequently and seriously to deepen and retain the habit of story in my pastoral work," what he calls my conversation and my proclamation. And often the moments of intensity in our lives, whether that's good intensity or bad intensity, it can feel like all that our lives are. And it's helpful to be reminded by stories that it's just a moment in our life. And that really helps us when we're helping others who are often in the acute pain and the drama of those intense moments. Okay, my fourth reason is that fiction offers us imaginative glimpses into another's life, allowing us to better understand others' experience. I want to illustrate this by the novel which I read just before creating this presentation by the wonderful Irish writer Niall Williams. This is his book, A History of the Rain, and the story here is taken, the main character rather, whose point of view the story is told in, is a girl, a teenager, who has a lot of health problems and spends a lot of time being carried out of her room in a stretcher into a hospital, into an ambulance, and from the ambulance to a hospital. And there's a little moment in this story where the narrator uses almost as an analogy, a moment that she experiences. She says, he, describing somebody else, is in that bounce that I know too. When you're tied into the stretcher and they carry you along and all you can see is the sky above moving backwards like you're floating down river and thinking how peculiar it is to be on your back moving through the world. And that was it. It was just this little sentence that just offers this little glimpse of what it's like to be in a stretcher going down the stairs. Well, a few weeks later, after reading this, I was talking to a patient that I was working with, and this patient was describing a trip in the ambulance to another hospital, and was just describing how hard that was. And I said, "Oh, you mean because you're tied to this stretcher, and all you can see is the world above you? You're being carried around by people who are strangers to you." And she says, yes, that's it. That's exactly it. And I was able to connect with this patient at a deeper level. And if I had not read that book and noticed this little image, I don't know if I would have been able to have grasped that experience in the same way, because I've never been in a stretcher or in an ambulance. C.S. Lewis, who I assume needs no introduction, was, in addition to, I'm giving an introduction anyways, but in addition to being a novelist and a writer about Christianity, his primary job was a literature professor. And he writes about what that experience is like to read something other than your own story. He says, we seek an enlargement of our being. We want to be more than ourselves. We want to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, to feel with other hearts, as well as with our own. We want to get out of the self, to correct its provincialism, and to heal its loneliness. And then he adds this wonderful little quote, "My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through the eyes of others." And really, so much of our work in caring for others is feeling with other hearts as well as our own, and expanding and enlarging our sense of our being so that we can compassionately understand others. And this is what literature or fiction or even film enables us in some ways. Number 5, fiction helps us recognize and love the people we encounter. What I mean by this is the way that good writers offer us, through their specific use of words and their specific attention to people, glimpses into people that I don't think we would get otherwise. Let me give you another example from that novel I recently read. This is the narrator describing her mother. "Ma'am sits beside me. You can see the bravery in her. You can see how she will not be defeated, how the world has thrown sadness after sadness at her and knocked her down, and she's still getting up. She's older than she was, and there's these few silver hairs coming at her temples, and her eyes have that extra deepness of knowledge that makes her more beautiful in a kind of lasting way." I mean, what a wonderful description of a person. And by getting a glimpse of this, we're able, I think, to value another person that we see. When we see somebody with those silver hairs and their eyes, that extra deepness of knowledge, I think we're able to appreciate them a bit more. Now, this is a positive example. I think it's especially true, though, when writers use this gift, this ability to describe people very, very well and very succinctly, especially when people that we aren't maybe that inclined to value. We can value a grieving mother, but it's harder to value other people. And I find it wonderful when story writers, and this is true of filmmakers as well, give us little vignettes, little characters that allow us to recognize people. I think the Coen brothers do this particularly well. Many of their minor characters are just, once you see them, you won't forget them, and you'll value people differently. Eugene Peterson says that all good novelists do this for us. They develop characters in ways that show us this person unlike any other before or after, and that the human condition is capable of endless variations, and that each variation is a marvel. When we recognize that in others and through writing, our own work with people becomes enriched because we value them more. And then finally, the reason I offer is that the gift of fiction offers us refreshment and an enlargement of our own vision. Here's Marilyn McIntyre again. "We need story, poetry, play, and song to replenish the well springs of imagination, to feed the spirit, to foster compassion." You see, when we're exhausted, when we're worn out from our own world, our own people in our own world that we're called to serve, there's something wonderful about how we're able to use a movie or a story to enter into another world and then take us out of our own story. But then when we close that book, we return to our own world, the world we're called to, refreshed and I think a little bit wiser. And I think it's a wonderful gift when fiction enables us to do that. So here in summary are the 5 reasons. I wonder which of these reasons resonates with your own experience. I also wonder which of these reasons is a new way of looking at fiction or stories for you. I'd love to hear your comments in the comments below. So, with all that said, and with that case made, what kind of stories should we be reading? This is where I want to offer a guiding principle, which is this. Cliches are a violation of language and of people. What do I mean by cliches? Well, cliches are language that, or patterns really, that are often repeated until they become a shorthand for what they are actually describing. And where I get this kind of danger of cliche is again from Eugene Peterson. He writes that gossip and cliches are a violation of language. They create a lack of reverence and a lack of accuracy for the people that they describe. And so I want to offer 3 different ways that cliches are dangerous and how these cliches can appear in fiction, stories, and movies, and even songs. The first is cliches of language. Cliches of language, I think, keep us trapped on well-worn paths. They're ways of expressing the world that become a kind of form of laziness, really. And they keep us from seeing the world afresh because they just reinforce these old patterns, these old habits of seeing. An example of this comes from the book A Gentleman in Moscow, which I read a couple of years ago, a well-loved book by many, but it uses a lot of cliches to describe the people. The author keeps using the word willowy to describe the main female character. And while you could use the word willowy cleverly and well to describe a female, I've used that word for describing somebody who is long, thin, and tall, but who also is grounded and has deep roots, and someone who loves the water and finds herself refreshed by tears. So that's a way of using willowy in a way that works against a cliche. It takes an assumption about a person and strengthens and goes deeper and goes beyond that assumption. But continuing to use that word as a shorthand, if I were to use that word every time I describe this person, I think then I'm falling into a cliche and I'm becoming lazy in my thinking and even harmful in my thinking. So that's a cliche of language. Another example is a cliche of character, a character who appears a certain way again and again, and that strengthens our assumptions of who people are. I was describing this in my presentation, and one of my friends in the room said, "Oh yes, I've had this happen." She said, "I'm blonde, and the number of times that I hear blonde jokes or people make assumptions about me because I'm blonde as being someone who's thoughtless and lightheaded, really frustrates me because I'm none of those things. I'm a very thoughtful, very grounded, very thoughtful person." And I said, yes, so a writer or a director who uses a blonde character again and again would be reinforcing this cliche and help making us see every blonde woman that we see as being like this, and thereby trapping us from seeing these people, such as my friend, as who they really are. Finally, I think there's a cliche of plot, a story which will end in the way we expect it to end. And these trap us in our expectations. They trap us in the ways that we see the world. So I think cliches of language, cliches of character, cliches of plot, when we see them in books, movies, or songs, they can provide us a bit of a warning. Do we choose such stories, and do they reinforce the stories? If the stories we pick, do they reinforce these cliches? Or do they surprise us and open up new spaces of language, of understanding, and of possibility? And the good news is that the more we read cliche-free, or mostly cliche-free literature or watch such movies, the more we're trained to enjoy it. And Lewis gets at this when he says, the best safeguard against bad literature is a full experience of good. Keep reading good books. Keep watching good movies, and you will learn to appreciate and enjoy them more and more, and the cliche-filled stuff just won't appeal as much anymore. Okay, I'd like to end this presentation now by talking about 4 genres which I haven't spoken that much about so far. I've been talking quite a bit about novels, and I think they are the best at helping us do this, but I'd like to touch on 4 other genres briefly. The first is the genre of graphic novels. What graphic novels allow us to do in ways that fiction doesn't do in the same way is they allow us to see the world through images. And I particularly appreciate how graphic novelists can often allow the images of a person's past experience to intersect with their present. For me, as a visual thinker, this happens all the time. I'll be having an experience in the real world, and the memory of an experience or a person or a time comes back to me. The two kind of interweave, the real and the memory. And graphic novelists, because they're telling stories primarily through pictures, can be very good at showing this to us. An example that I really like comes from Jeff Lemire, a Canadian, who in his book The Collected Essex County tells 3 short stories that take place in the same farming community and have the same cast of characters, but these stories take place across many, many decades. And he's able to do this thing quite often in the story where a character, in this case it's an old man being cared for by a nurse, appears one way, and in this case this old man is not particularly easy to deal with, but then the graphic novelist is able to take us inside that old man's head and inside that old man's expression, and show us what that person's past experience was like. I'm just fast forward a bit too much there, but here again you see this old man showing up in the present, in the past rather, and the past and the present intersect so that at one point in the novel he is remembering a mistake that he made, a decision he made that had terrible consequences, and the scene, the memory takes place on a cold winter's night on a rooftop. And the graphic novelist shows the old man remembering this as if he were the moon, and the moon weeping tears. It's just a beautifully done scene. And so I think as we work with people who, especially in a nursing home context or an older life context, that have these stories, reading a book like this can train us for recognizing how people's past stories shape who they are today. So that's the genre of graphic novels. Another genre is memoir. As part of our CPE training, each member of our group is instructed to present their memoir, their autobiography, to the class. And this takes over an hour. It's about an hour and a half to 2 hours of sharing your story and having others respond to it. And what I found is that this experience at the beginning of our training was so valuable because it helped us understand each other and how these individuals in our group were interacting with their patients, but it also helped us understand ourselves. And then because of this deep immersion in our own stories and the stories of others, we were able to see our patients, as well as even our friends and relatives or strangers, differently. That is the value of hearing someone's story. And a memoir is a book written by someone who's especially gifted and skilled at telling their story. I think there are 2 ways that memoirs can really help us. The first is by offering us glimpses into lives that are very different from our own. I'll never forget reading several years ago the book by this trans Canadian writer, Ivan Coyote, in which they describe their experience growing up as trans and their experience before surgery and after surgery. Now, you can debate, I think, the merits and ethics of this kind of trans identity, really, and the surgeries that go with it all you want. But until you're able to really understand and feel what it's like to be a trans person in a body that doesn't feel like your own, I think those kinds of debates are not as helpful. So there's something profoundly helpful for me about hearing this and feeling this through this writer's eyes, and it then changed how I viewed trans people going forward. So that's an example of a life very different from my own. But also, memoirs allow us to observe patterns in lives. By observing a pattern in their own lives, memoirists allow us to notice similar patterns in our own lives. One of the writers that really helped me with this is the American Frederick Buechner, and Buechner wrote 4 memoirs, each of which are rather short, and he wrote these over the course of about 2 or so decades, and they're brilliant. He has this to say at the beginning of one of them: "As I look back over the events of my life, I think I see patterns, casual relationships, suggestions of meaning that I was mostly unaware of at the time." And by bringing these patterns to life and pulling them out of his own story, it helps me recognize those patterns in my own life and in the lives of others. He adds that memory makes it possible for us to both bless the past, even those parts of it that we have always felt cursed by, and also to be blessed by it. I think this is what psychotherapy and the forgiveness of sins is all about. The interplay of God's forgiveness of us and our forgiveness of God and each other, and I would add ourselves. I think it's just a brilliant description of what good memoir and good autobiography allows us to do. Okay, the third genre is film, one of my favorites, and I'm just going to illustrate a couple ways that film works distinct, perhaps, from fiction. The first thing that film can do is it can show us great compassion to particular people. A wonderful example of this is the German filmmaker Wim Wenders' film Paris, Texas. The main character in this film is, well, hard to love at first. He's gruff, he's not very well dressed, he's dirty, and he's completely silent. And he's a character that, if you were to see him on the street, you probably wouldn't spend much time with him. At least I wouldn't. But over the course of the film, others, particularly I think it's his brother, shows great compassion to him and takes time with him. And the filmmaker, Wim Wenders, does this himself with the character. And by the end of the film, you understand why this person has become the way he has. And you have great compassion, even love for this person. So that's something that film enables us to do. Is it trains us in having compassion to people, especially those who we're less inclined to have compassion to. Another thing that film does is it gives us a glimpse into lives that are very different from our own. 2 examples of this. One is the American film Do the Right Thing, just a masterpiece of a movie. And it takes place in a black neighborhood in New York over the course of a single day. By the end of the day, there's a race riot and a popular restaurant, is burnt down. If you had seen this scene on its own, you would probably be angry at the residents for burning down this place and causing such destruction to their neighborhood. But because this scene happens at the end of the film, after we've been immersed in the lives and the tensions and the injustices of this community, you actually understand why this was a necessary act, a tragedy nonetheless, but still something that came out of the conditions of that neighborhood. I think foreign films do this particularly well, giving us glimpses into lives that are different from our own, because foreign films offer us another culture on its own terms. This is not a culture translating itself to us or trying to invite us as tourists in. Instead, it is people from another culture telling their own stories of that culture, and we are immersed in them, and we have to figure them out through the help of a translation. And then an example of this, you could choose many, but the one that came to mind is the film Shoplifters by the Japanese director Kurida. And this is a movie that shows the life of a family in Japan on the margins of society, and you're immersed in that world. It's completely other than my own experience, and it teaches us what that other experience is like. Finally, film gives us a glimpse of a person's formation over the course of a few hours, or in some cases, a few films. A good example of this is Moonlight. This is the story of a young black man and how he grows up. It is shown in 3 parts with 3 different actors playing the same character. And by the time we get to the end of the film and we see this black man and his experience, we understand him so much more because we've seen his childhood and his adolescence. It is quite the gift to be able to do this over the course of a few hours. Other films do this over the course of a series of films. The Indian filmmaker Saoirse Ray his Apu trilogy, which is 3 films that show. I'm missing a photo there. 3 films that show us a young boy. We see him on the cover here. And then in the next film, he's played by a different actor as a teenager, and then finally as a young traumatized man. And what a gift to be able to see the same character over the course of 3 films. And by the end of it, again, you just get a sense of who this person is in a way you never would otherwise. And it's wonderful that it takes place in a culture and country very different from our own. Another film series that does this through the story of a relationship. How does a relationship shift over time? This is the Before trilogy by Richard Linklater. In this one, it's not 3 separate actors. It's the 2 same actors, but he filmed it over the course of about 9 years apart each film, so about 30 years. And we're able to see this relationship shift and change over time in a way that it's harder to do in real life. It's not very often that we get to see a couple's lives change over the course of say 9 hours. So those are 3 reasons why I think film can help us here. The final genre, and the genre I want to end with, is the genre of story songs. And this is a songwriter who takes a story and tells that story through music over the course of, on average, 3 minutes, although some are longer. And I think what story songs do, which these other genres, including fiction, don't do, is they add the emotion of music and the way that music summons a whole nother layer of emotion. The other thing that these story songs do is that they're compact, and it's very easy to be brought back into that world through the course of re-listening to that song, or even pulling the song up in your head if you know it well enough. All of a sudden you're back there and you are able to get a feeling of that story again. Let me give you 4 examples of songwriters who do this really well. Paul Simon, I think he's an expert at doing this with emotion. So he will tell a story, such as in Darling Lorraine, the story of a marriage and its ups and downs, and capture the emotion of what it feels like to have that longing for something more while also loving and being frustrated by the person that you're with. Or in the 2 songs, Street Angel in a Parade, he captures the feeling of schizophrenia by a homeless person on the street and in a hospital in a way that just gets you inside that world and makes you feel that emotion so much. Kendrick Lamar, he's very good at showing moral culpability. He'll tell a story that you think is going to end one way, and at the last minute in the last verse, he flips it all around and you realize he's telling a story about himself, or a story in which he himself is the person who is culpable, morally culpable. It's listening to him stretches our moral imagination in very good ways. Sufjan Stevens is very good at autobiography, telling stories from his own life with just a stunning range of emotion and fragility to the emotion. The song Should Have Known Better, but it comes from his album Carrie and Lowell, and really I could just put that whole album here as an example, because it is the story of his being raised by his mother, and his mother passing away. And he had a very troubled relationship with his mother. It was not a good relationship, and yet her death brings up all these intense emotions and these fragile, beautiful memories. I listened to this album again in preparing this presentation while working in the hospital, and it made me realize, these people coming in who are grieving, or maybe not visibly grieving the lives of their parents who are dying, they could have stories just as rich and emotions just as complex as these. And Sufjan's able to show that to us over the course of an album or over the course of a song. But the final example of a songwriter doing this, who I really do think is the best at this, is Bruce Springsteen. And Bruce Springsteen's songs, they often capture stories of people whose stories aren't usually told. His stories, his narrators in his songs are often factory workers or highway patrolmen, or immigrants, people who who are often have this gruff, hardened exterior, and yet Springsteen from his own life knows that there's a deep emotion and deep fragility behind all that, and his songs and the way that he merges lyrics with gorgeous melody is really good for helping us do that. And I want to end this presentation by telling you a story about how an album by him really helped me in my own work. I was working with a woman, and one day she told me her life story, and she told it with me with such emotion. She was really struggling to share this with me and to manage the grief and the feelings that she had. And it was the first time in my work where I really struggled in taking this story and these emotions of her home with me. It was very hard to carry these emotions that she had entrusted me with, and I didn't know how to do it. And so on my way home, I just put on the album I had been playing that same day, which was Inyo by Bruce Springsteen. This is an album he mostly recorded in 1990, didn't release until this last summer. And the album features mostly Bruce Springsteen and his guitar telling stories of people from California, a lot of immigrant stories. And he does what he does so well, which is over the course of a few minutes, offer a snapshot into a person's life, the emotions of that person, the grief, the wounds of that person, and their stories weren't fixed. They didn't have kind of the happy ending or the wrapped up ending that we would have wanted, but they were offered to us as listeners. Someone had noticed these stories, and someone had captured these stories, in this case Bruce Springsteen, in a song. And I found it so comforting to listen to that and realize that this patient of mine had done the same thing with me. She had entrusted me with her story, and I might not have been able to fix it. I might not have been able to have assuaged that pain, but I have been able to hear it and to hold it. And Bruce Springsteen was allowing me to do the same with the stories he was telling. So there you go. That's my presentation on stories in the spiritual caregiver. I hope you found this helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I hope that you are inspired by this presentation to keep on reading, watching, and listening to good stories that help us in our own work of hearing our own stories and the stories of those around us. Thanks.